The morning of the Rosehill Green annual flower show dawned with the kind of perfect English summer weather that seemed almost too good to be true. The village green, normally a quiet expanse of grass bordered by ancient oaks and the occasional wandering sheep, had been transformed into a botanical wonderland of competing displays, striped marquees, and the gentle bustle of village life at its most refined. Mrs. Victoria Thornfield stood beside her prize roses, adjusting the small placard that proclaimed her crimson glory variety to be the finest in the county. At 62, she was a handsome woman who had retained the bearing of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the morning's preparations, her floral dress chosen to complement rather than compete with her beloved blooms. Really, Victoria, one might think you were preparing for the Chelsea Flower Show rather than our little village competition, called Mrs. Penelope Ashworth from the adjacent display, where her own roses, while undeniably beautiful, seemed somehow diminished by proximity to Mrs. Thornfield's magnificent specimens. "Standards must be maintained, my dear Penelope," Mrs. Thornfield replied with the kind of smile that managed to be both gracious and subtly condescending. "If we allow ourselves to become complacent simply because we're in the countryside, where does that leave us?" The exchange was typical of the gentle rivalry that characterized life in Rosehill Green, where competition over garden produce and floral arrangements could assume an importance that might seem absurd to outsiders, but which provided the very fabric of social interaction for the village residents. Colonel James Hartwell, distinguished in his military bearing despite being well into his 70s, paused in his examination of the vegetable marrows to observe the interaction between the two women. He had known both ladies for the better part of 2 decades, ever since his retirement to the village, and he recognized the particular tension that always seemed to exist between them during these annual competitions. "Lovely morning for the show," he remarked diplomatically, touching the brim of his Panama hat. "Your roses are particularly fine this year, Mrs. Thornfield. And Mrs. Ashworth, those delphiniums are quite spectacular." Mrs. Ashworth beamed at the compliment, though Mrs. Thornfield's expression suggested she found the comparison somewhat inappropriate. She was, after all, competing in the rose category, where she had won first prize for the past 3 consecutive years. Dr. Marcus Hammond, the village physician, approached the group carrying a cup of tea and a small notebook in which he was jotting observations about the various displays. At 55, he maintained the thoughtful, slightly distracted manner that came from years of listening carefully to what people said and, more importantly, to what they chose not to say. "Ladies, Colonel," he nodded pleasantly. "Magnificent show this year. Mrs. Thornfield, I believe your roses may have surpassed even last year's display." "How kind of you to say so, Doctor. Though I must confess, I've been rather concerned about some unusual markings I've noticed on a few of the leaves. Nothing that would affect the blooms, of course, but I do wonder if there might be some sort of pest problem developing." Dr. Hammond moved closer to examine the plant she indicated, his medical training having long ago expanded to include a considerable knowledge of plant diseases and garden pests. "I don't see anything immediately concerning," he said after a careful look, "though you might want to consult with young Stevens about it. He's become quite knowledgeable about these matters since taking over his father's nursery business." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Reverend Michael Whitmore, whose presence always brought a certain formal dignity to any gathering. At 48, he was relatively young for his position, but had quickly earned the respect of his parishioners through his thoughtful sermons and genuine interest in the welfare of his community. "Good morning, everyone. What a splendid turnout we have this year. Mrs. Thornfield, your roses are absolutely breathtaking. I do believe this may be your finest display yet." Mrs. Thornfield positively glowed at the praise, and for a moment the competitive edge in her manner softened into something approaching warmth. "You're too kind, Reverend. Though I must say, it's been a labor of love. These particular roses have been 3 years in the making." As the morning progressed, the village green filled with families and visitors from neighboring communities, all come to admire the displays and enjoy the gentle pleasures of an English country flower show. Children ran between the exhibits while their parents examined prize vegetables and compared notes on gardening techniques. The WIT tent did a brisk business, and the brass band from the next village provided a cheerful accompaniment to the proceedings. It was just past 11 o'clock when Mrs. Alice Pemberton, who served as one of the show's judges, approached Mrs. Thornfield's display with her clipboard and measuring tape. A small woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Mrs. Pemberton took her judging responsibilities very seriously indeed. "Mrs. Thornfield, if I might have a closer look at your roses? I need to make some measurements and check the stem quality for the final judging." "Of course, Mrs. Pemberton, though I do hope you'll be careful with the blooms. They're at their absolute peak today." Mrs. Pemberton began her examination, making notes and taking careful measurements, while Mrs. Thornfield hovered nearby with the anxious attention of someone watching their most precious possessions being handled by another. Other exhibitors and visitors gathered around, understanding that this formal judging process would determine the day's winners. It was Mrs. Pemberton who made the discovery, though at first she seemed uncertain about what she was seeing. She had bent down to examine the soil around the base of Mrs. Thornfield's prize roses when she stopped suddenly, her face going pale. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said in a voice that had lost all of its usual authority, I think you should step back from the display." "Whatever do you mean? Is there something wrong with the roses?" Mrs. Pemberton straightened slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for Mrs. Thornfield's arm. "My dear, I'm afraid there's been. That is to say, we need to call Dr. Hammond immediately." It was then that Mrs. Thornfield looked down and saw what had so disturbed the judge. Partially concealed among the carefully cultivated soil and mulch around her prize roses was something that clearly didn't belong there. Something that made her step back with a sharp intake of breath and brought Dr. Hammond running when Mrs. Pemberton called his name in a voice sharp with alarm. Within moments, word spread through the flower show with the peculiar speed that shocking news always seemed to achieve in small communities. The prize-winning roses that had been the centerpiece of Mrs. Thornfield's display were now surrounded by a growing crowd of horrified spectators, all trying to glimpse what Dr. Hammond was examining with grim concentration. It was Colonel Hartwell who took charge of the situation with the decisive authority that his military training had ingrained in him. "Everyone please step back and give the doctor room to work. Mrs. Whitmore, would you be so kind as to telephone the police from the vicarage? I'm afraid we're going to need them here as quickly as possible." The annual Rosehill Green flower show had come to an abrupt and shocking end. Among Mrs. Victoria Thornfield's prize-winning roses, someone had discovered the body of a man, and it was immediately clear to Dr. Hammond that this was no accidental death. Perhaps Mrs. Pemberton. She's lived here all her life and has an excellent memory for local connections. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Pemberton approached the group, having apparently overcome her initial shock sufficiently to resume her natural role as one of the village's primary sources of information. "Inspector Craddock, I presume? I'm Alice Pemberton. I was the one who found him." She paused, collecting herself. "I understand you might have questions about local connections?" "Indeed, Mrs. Pemberton. The deceased has been identified as Harold Wickham, from London. Does that name ring any bells for you?" Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful, and Inspector Craddock could see that she was mentally reviewing decades of village history with a thoroughness that only long-time residents could manage. "Wickham," she repeated slowly. "There was a family named Wickham who lived here during the war years, though they left not long after the war ended. But Harold, let me think. There was a young man named Harry Wickham who worked for a time at the postal office. This would have been in the mid-1940s, mind you. He was here for perhaps 2 years before he moved on to London, I believe. Do you recall anything else about him? Why he left? Whether he had any particular connections in the village?" Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, and Inspector Craddock sensed that she was weighing what she should say. "Well, Inspector, there were some irregularities in the postal accounts around the time he left. Nothing was ever proven, you understand, but there were questions about whether all the mail was being delivered properly, particularly some of the parcels that were supposed to contain ration goods." Inspector Craddock found this information very interesting indeed. If Harold Wickham had left Rosehill Green under a cloud of suspicion regarding postal fraud, his return after more than a decade might well have stirred up old resentments or fears. Mrs. Pemberton, can you think of anyone in the village who might have particularly strong feelings about Mr. Wickham's return? Anyone who might have been personally affected by the postal irregularities? This time Mrs. Pemberton's hesitation was more pronounced, and she glanced around nervously before responding. Well, Inspector, I really couldn't say for certain, but there were rumors at the time that some of the missing parcels contained items that were quite valuable on the black market. Medical supplies, certain foodstuffs, that sort of thing. Several families in the village suffered real hardship when expected parcels failed to arrive. Inspector Craddock was beginning to see the outline of a motive emerging. If Harold Wickham had indeed been stealing from the postal system during the war years, his return to Rosehill Green might have been seen as a threat by someone who had suffered as a result of his actions, or by someone who feared that his presence might lead to the reopening of old investigations. As he looked around at the peaceful village scene, with its flower show displays and concerned residents, Inspector Craddock reflected on how often the most violent crimes had their roots in events that had occurred years, or even decades earlier. The war years had been a time of great upheaval and moral ambiguity, when ordinary people had sometimes been driven to extraordinary actions by circumstances beyond their control. Now, it appeared, the past had come back to Rosehill Green with deadly consequences. As they finished their tea, Miss Marple found herself mentally cataloging the various threads of the mystery that would need to be explored. There was Harold Wickham's wartime activities and the impact they had on village residents. There was his recent return and his interest in local history. There was the choice to place his body among Mrs. Thornfield's roses, and there was the question of who in the village had both motive and opportunity for murder. Colonel, I wonder if you might introduce me to some of the other residents tomorrow? I find that conversations over tea can be remarkably illuminating when one is trying to understand the relationships and histories that shape a community. Of course, Miss Marple, I'm certain that several of the ladies would be delighted to meet you, particularly given your reputation. Though I should warn you that everyone is rather on edge about the investigation. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear Colonel, I found that people are often most willing to share important information precisely when they're feeling unsettled. Fear and anxiety have a way of loosening tongues that might otherwise remain discreetly silent. As she prepared for bed in the comfortable guest room Colonel Hartwell had provided, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that seemed to be emerging. Harold Wickham had returned to a village where his wartime activities had caused real harm to several residents. Someone had killed him and deliberately placed his body where it would be discovered in the most dramatic possible fashion, disrupting the village's premier social event. This suggested that the murder was not simply about revenge for past wrongs, but was also intended to send a message. The question was, what message and to whom? I'm not suggesting anything specific, Mrs. Pemberton replied diplomatically. But I will say that there were people who seemed to have access to ration goods when others were going without. And there were questions about how certain individuals managed to maintain their standard of living during such difficult times. Miss Marple understood that she was being given a very delicate hint about wartime collaboration with black market activities. If Harold Wickham had returned to the village with knowledge about such collaboration, he might have represented a threat to people who had spent the past 15 years building respectable lives on foundations that would not bear close scrutiny. One final question, if I may. Do either of you have any thoughts about why Harold Wickham's body was placed specifically among Mrs. Thornfield's roses? Mrs. Fletcher looked puzzled. That is odd, isn't it? Particularly since Mrs. Thornfield wasn't even living in the village during the war years. But Mrs. Pemberton's expression had become thoughtful. Actually, Miss Marple, there might be a connection that hasn't been considered. Mrs. Thornfield's late husband was in the import-export business, and I believe they lived in London during the war years. It's possible that Harold might have known them from that period, particularly if he was involved in questionable activities that extended beyond the village. This was a revelation that Miss Marple found very significant indeed. If Mrs. Thornfield had connections to Harold Wickham that predated her arrival in Rosehill Green, the placement of his body among her roses might not have been arbitrary after all. As she walked back to Colonel Hartwell's cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of wartime relationships and activities that seemed to underlie the present tragedy. Someone in Rosehill Green had killed Harold Wickham, and the motive almost certainly lay in events that had occurred 15 years earlier during a time when ordinary moral standards had been disrupted by the extraordinary circumstances of war. But they also frequently involved complications in relationships that were not immediately apparent to investigators who focused too narrowly on the most obvious explanations. Harold Wickham had returned to Rosehill Green after 15 years, asking questions about wartime activities and relationships. Someone had killed him and placed his body among Mrs. Thornfield's prize roses, ensuring that his death would create maximum disruption to village life. The placement seemed deliberate and symbolic, not simply a matter of convenience or shock value. If Dr. Hammond was indeed the killer, Miss Marple wondered what message had he been trying to send by choosing that particular location for the body. And why had he been so careless as to retain the murder weapon in his medical bag, where it would inevitably be discovered? These questions troubled her as she drifted off to sleep, and she resolved to pursue them further during her conversation with Dr. Hammond the following morning. Of course, Miss Marple, though I should warn you that Victoria has been quite upset about having the body discovered among her roses. She feels that the incident has somehow tainted her reputation in the village. Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Thornfield's concern about her reputation might be more justified than she realized, particularly if there were indeed connections between her late husband's business activities and Harold Wickham's wartime schemes. The placement of Wickham's body among her prize roses might not have been arbitrary after all, but rather a deliberate message about secrets that someone felt needed to be exposed. Dr. Hammond's surgery was located in a converted cottage near the center of the village, its well-maintained exterior and carefully tended garden reflecting the methodical attention to detail that characterized its owner. Miss Marple arrived for her appointment shortly after 9 o'clock, accompanied by Colonel Hartwell, who had arranged the meeting with the discretion that such sensitive circumstances required. Dr. Hammond greeted them with the professional courtesy that had clearly become second nature over his years of medical practice, though Miss Marple could see immediately that he was under considerable strain. His face was drawn with fatigue, and his usual air of quiet confidence had been replaced by something approaching desperation. "Miss Marple, Colonel Hartwell has told me of your reputation for solving difficult mysteries. I must confess that I'm hoping you might be able to see something that Inspector Craddock has missed. Dr. Hammond, I understand that you're in a very difficult position. Perhaps you could tell me, in your own words, about your interactions with Harold Wickham during his recent visit to the village." Dr. Hammond gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs he kept for patient consultations, then took a moment to compose his thoughts before responding. "I did speak with Harold Wickham at the Rose and Crown, though I initially told Inspector Craddock that I hadn't seen him. I realize now that this was a mistake, but I was trying to avoid becoming involved in what I knew would be a complicated investigation." "What was the nature of your conversation with Mr. Wickham?" "He approached me, actually. He seemed to recognize me from the old days, though I must confess that I didn't immediately remember him. He asked if I was still practicing medicine in the village, and whether I recalled the shortages of medical supplies during the war years." Miss Marple found this interesting. "He specifically mentioned the medical supply shortages?" "Yes, and that's what made me uncomfortable about the conversation. He seemed to be suggesting that he had information about what had happened to those missing supplies, and he hinted that there were people in the village who might be interested in hearing what he knew." Colonel Hartwell leaned forward. "Are you saying that Wickham was attempting some sort of blackmail?" "I'm not certain, but that was my impression. He was very careful about what he actually said, but the implications seemed to be that he knew things about wartime activities that could cause problems for certain people if they became public knowledge." Miss Marple considered this carefully. If Harold Wickham had indeed been attempting blackmail, it would certainly provide additional motives for his murder beyond simple revenge for past wrongs. "Dr. Hammond, did Mr. Wickham specifically threaten you or suggest that you had been involved in anything improper?" "Not directly, no, but he did ask some very pointed questions about my medical practice during the war years, and about whether I had ever found alternative sources for supplies when the official channels failed to deliver what we needed. This was a delicate question," Miss Marple realized. During the war years, many people have been forced to operate in moral gray areas, obtaining necessary items through unofficial channels when the official systems failed. Such activities might have been technically illegal, but morally justifiable under the circumstances. And had you found alternative sources for medical supplies? Dr. Hammond hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Miss Marple, during the war years, people were dying because we couldn't get the medicines and equipment we needed. If someone offered to help obtain those supplies, even through irregular channels, it seemed wrong to refuse simply because the proper procedures weren't being followed. I understand completely, Dr. Hammond, but I take it that Mr. Wickham knew about these alternative arrangements. That was certainly the impression he gave. He seemed to know details about specific instances when we had obtained supplies through unofficial sources, and he hinted that he had documentation that could prove these activities had taken place. Miss Marple was beginning to see a much more complex picture than the one Inspector Craddock had presented. If Harold Wickham had possessed detailed knowledge about wartime black market activities involving multiple village residents, his murder might have been motivated by the need to protect several people rather than by one individual's desire for revenge. Dr. Hammond, I must ask you directly, did you kill Harold Wickham? No, Miss Marple, I did not. I was angry about his implied threats, and I'll admit that I found his attitude offensive, but I would never resort to violence. My entire career has been dedicated to preserving life, not taking it. Then how do you explain the scalpel that Inspector Craddock found in your medical bag? Dr. Hammond's expression became deeply troubled. I genuinely have no idea how that scalpel got there, Miss Marple. I reported it as lost several weeks ago because I couldn't find it anywhere in the surgery. When Inspector Craddock showed it to me yesterday, I was as surprised as anyone to see it. Is it possible that someone could have taken the scalpel without your knowledge and then returned it to your medical bag after the murder? I suppose it's possible, though it would require someone with access to my surgery and detailed knowledge of my equipment. The scalpel was a specialized instrument that I used for particular types of procedures. Miss Marple made a mental note to explore who in the village might have had such access and knowledge. Dr. Hammond, did Mr. Wickham mention any other village residents by name during your conversation? He asked about Mrs. Ashworth specifically, and whether I knew if she had ever found alternative ways to obtain her husband's medications during the war years. He also mentioned Mrs. Thornfield, though that surprised me since she wasn't living in the village at that time. What did he say about Mrs. Thornfield? He asked if I knew anything about her late husband's business activities and whether she had ever mentioned having connections to import-export operations during the war years. It struck me as an odd question, since most people don't discuss such historical details in casual conversation. This confirmed Mrs. Pemberton's suggestion that there might have been a connection between the Thornfields and Harold Wickham that predated Victoria Thornfield's arrival in Rosehill Green. Miss Marple resolved to explore this possibility further. As they prepared to leave Dr. Hammond's surgery, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Inspector Craddock's case against the doctor was based on incomplete information. While Dr. Hammond clearly had concerns about Harold Wickham's presence in the village, his responses to her questions had the ring of truth. More importantly, the evidence suggested that Harold Wickham had been engaged in a complex scheme involving multiple village residents, not simply seeking revenge against one individual. If that was the case, then the killer might be someone who had not yet attracted Inspector Craddock's attention. "Colonel," she said as they walked back toward his cottage, "I believe it would be very helpful if I could have a conversation with Mrs. Thornfield this afternoon. Her connection to Harold Wickham may be more significant than anyone has realized." Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Fletcher the following morning revealed yet another layer of complexity in the relationships that had shaped Harold Wickham's fate. They met in the back garden of the Rose and Crown, where Mrs. Fletcher was tending to the herb garden that supplied the pub's kitchen with fresh seasonings. "Mrs. Fletcher, I understand that you knew Harold Wickham quite well during his time working at the postal office." "Oh yes, Miss Marple. He was a regular customer at the pub, and we often chatted about village happenings. He seemed like a pleasant enough young man, though there was always something a bit calculating about him, if you know what I mean." "Calculating in what way?" Well, he always seemed to know everyone's business, and he had a way of asking questions that made you tell him more than you intended to. He was particularly interested in who was expecting what sorts of deliveries, and whether people had received what they were supposed to get. Miss Marple could see how Harold Wickham's position at the postal office, combined with his social interactions at the pub, would have given him comprehensive knowledge about village residents' expectations and disappointments regarding postal deliveries. Mrs. Fletcher, Colonel Hartwell mentioned that your mother-in-law died during the winter of 1947, and that there were questions about heating oil deliveries that failed to arrive. Mrs. Fletcher's expression became sad and angry simultaneously. My mother-in-law was elderly and frail, Miss Marple. She was depending on regular deliveries of heating oil to keep her cottage warm during that terrible winter. When the deliveries stopped coming, she developed pneumonia and died within a week. And you believe that Harold Wickham was responsible for the missing deliveries? I couldn't prove it, of course, but the timing was very suspicious. The deliveries had been regular until Harold started working at the postal office, and then they became increasingly unreliable. Other people in the village were having similar problems with important shipments that simply vanished. Did you confront Harold about your suspicions? I tried to, but he was very clever about deflecting questions and making excuses. He always had explanations about postal system problems and wartime disruptions that made it difficult to pin down exactly what was happening. Miss Marple was beginning to understand that Harold Wickham had been a more sophisticated criminal than she had initially realized. His theft activities had been carefully planned and executed in ways that made them difficult to prove, even when the victim suspected what was happening. Mrs. Fletcher, when Harold returned to the village recently, did he attempt to contact you? He did indeed, Miss Marple. He came to the pub on his first evening back and sought me out specifically. He said he wanted to apologize for what had happened during the war years, and he offered to provide me with information that might help me seek compensation for my family's losses. The same offer he made to Mrs. Ashworth? So it seems, though I suspect his motivations weren't as altruistic as he claimed. He mentioned that there were people in the village who had profited from the stolen goods, and he seemed very interested in whether I would be willing to pursue legal action against them. Miss Marple could see that Harold Wickham had been attempting to orchestrate a complex scheme in which his former victims would pursue legal action against his former accomplices, with himself positioned as the key witness whose testimony would be essential for any successful claims. Such a scheme would have given him considerable leverage for extracting money from all parties involved. Did you agree to cooperate with his plan? I told him I would think about it, Miss Marple, but honestly, I wasn't inclined to trust him. If he had been genuinely sorry about what happened during the war years, he had 15 years to contact us and make amends. The fact that he was only doing so now, and in connection with some scheme to extract money from other people, made his motives rather suspect. Mrs. Fletcher's assessment of Harold Wickham's character was proving to be quite perceptive. Miss Marple was increasingly convinced that Wickham's return to Rosehill Green had been motivated entirely by greed rather than any genuine desire to make amends for past wrongs. Mrs. Fletcher, do you have any thoughts about who might have killed Harold? Mrs. Fletcher paused in her gardening and considered the question carefully. Miss Marple, I've been thinking about that question constantly since his body was discovered. The problem is that there are several people in the village who had both motive and opportunity, and most of them are people I've known and respected for years. Can you be more specific? Well, there's Mrs. Ashworth, who lost her husband partly because of Harold's activities. There's Dr. Hammond, who was frustrated by medical supply shortages that may have contributed to preventable deaths. There's Mrs. Thornfield, who apparently profited from Harold's thefts and would have been vulnerable to blackmail. Mrs. Fletcher hesitated before continuing. But Miss Marple, I think you should also consider that there might be people involved in this situation who haven't attracted attention yet. Harold's return to the village didn't just threaten individuals who had been directly affected by his activities. It also threatened the peace and stability that we've all worked to rebuild since the war ended. This was an interesting perspective that Miss Marple hadn't fully considered. If someone had killed Harold Wickham not for personal reasons, but to protect the community as a whole from the disruption his schemes would have caused, It would suggest a different type of killer with different motivations. Are you suggesting that someone might have acted out of a sense of community responsibility rather than personal grievance? I'm suggesting that there are people in Rosehill Green who care deeply about maintaining the harmony and stability of village life, and who might have seen Harold's return as a fundamental threat to everything we've accomplished since the war years. As Miss Marple walked back through the village center, she reflected on Mrs. Fletcher's suggestion. If the killer had been motivated by a desire to protect the community rather than to avenge personal wrongs, it would suggest someone with deep roots in the village and strong attachments to its residents. Such a person might have access to information about multiple residents' wartime experiences, understanding of the complex relationships that had developed over the years, and the kind of moral authority that would justify taking extreme action to prevent Harold Wickham's schemes from destroying the peace that had been so carefully rebuilt. The more Miss Marple considered this possibility, the more it seemed to fit with both the symbolic nature of the murder and the careful planning that had been involved in its execution. Someone had killed Harold Wickham not in a moment of passion or panic, but as a deliberate act designed to send a clear message about the consequences of threatening community stability. The question remained, who in Rosehill Green possessed the combination of knowledge, authority, and moral conviction necessary to serve as the community's unofficial protector? The peaceful rhythm of Miss Marple's investigation was shattered the following morning when Colonel Hartwell received an urgent telephone call from Inspector Craddock. Mrs. Thornfield had been found dead in her garden, apparently having suffered a heart attack while examining the damage to her prize roses. Miss Marple and Colonel Hartwell hurried to Mrs. Thornfield's house, where they found Inspector Craddock supervising the removal of the body while Dr. Hammond attended to the official medical examination. The scene was far less dramatic than Harold Wickham's murder had been, but somehow more unsettling in its implications. Dr. Hammond, what's your preliminary assessment? Inspector Craddock asked as they gathered in Mrs. Thornfield's drawing room. It appears to be a straightforward case of cardiac arrest, Inspector. Mrs. Thornfield had a history of heart problems, and the stress of recent events would certainly have been a contributing factor. However, I want to have a more thorough examination conducted to rule out any other possibilities. Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with the same careful attention she had given to Harold Wickham's murder. Mrs. Thornfield had been found among her roses, in almost exactly the same location where Wickham's body had been discovered. The timing, less than a week after the original murder, seemed too coincidental to dismiss. Inspector Craddock, was there any evidence of disturbance in the garden? Any sign that Mrs. Thornfield might have been meeting with someone before her collapse? Nothing obvious, Miss Marple, though the garden has been rather trampled by all the police activity over the past few days. It would be difficult to identify new disturbances among the existing ones. Colonel Hartwell looked genuinely shaken by this second death. Inspector, surely you don't suspect that Mrs. Thornfield was murdered as well. I'm not prepared to rule anything out at this point, Colonel. 2 deaths in less than a week, both connected to the same location and the same underlying circumstances, strikes me as highly suspicious. Miss Marple was inclined to agree with Inspector Craddock's caution. While Mrs. Thornfield's death might indeed have been natural, occurring at such a crucial point in the investigation suggested the possibility that someone had decided to eliminate a potentially dangerous witness. Dr. Hammond, when did you last see Mrs. Thornfield? Did she seem particularly distressed about anything specific? I spoke with her yesterday afternoon, Miss Marple. She was certainly upset about the continued police presence around her property, and she mentioned being concerned about how the village residents were gossiping about her possible connections to Harold Wickham. Did she say anything specific about those connections? Dr. Hammond hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with discussing a patient's confidential concerns. She expressed regret about certain aspects of her past, Miss Marple, and she seemed to be wrestling with whether she should reveal information that might be relevant to the investigation. This was extremely significant. If Mrs. Thornfield had been contemplating making revelations about Harold Wickham's wartime activities, her death might have been intended to prevent those revelations from becoming public. Did she give you any indication of what sort of information she was considering revealing? She mentioned having documents related to her late husband's business activities during the war years. She said there were records that would clarify exactly what had happened to certain postal shipments and who had been involved in redirecting them. Inspector Craddock looked up from his notebook with sharp interest. Documents? Did she say where these documents were kept? She mentioned a safe in her study, where she kept important papers. She said she had been considering whether to turn those documents over to the police, but that she was concerned about the implications for other people who might be mentioned in them. Miss Marple realized that Mrs. Thornfield's death might have been motivated by someone's desperate need to prevent those documents from being examined. If the records contained detailed information about the wartime black market conspiracy, they could have implicated multiple people who were still living in the village. Inspector, I think it would be very important to examine those documents as soon as possible. Agreed, Miss Marple. I'll need to obtain a warrant, but given the circumstances, that shouldn't be difficult to arrange. As they waited for the legal formalities to be completed, Miss Marple found herself reconsidering her assessment of the killer's motivations. If Mrs. Thornfield had indeed been murdered to prevent her from revealing information about wartime activities, it suggested that the killer was someone who would have been seriously damaged by those revelations. More troubling was the implication that the killer had been monitoring the investigation closely enough to know about Mrs. Thornfield's conversations with Dr. Hammond and her contemplation of revealing additional information. This suggested someone with intimate knowledge of village relationships and possibly professional access to confidential information. When Inspector Craddock finally gained access to Mrs. Thornfield's safe, the results were both illuminating and disturbing. The documents contained detailed records of financial transactions, shipping manifests, and correspondence that painted a comprehensive picture of the black market conspiracy that had operated in and around Rosehill Green during the war years. Harold Wickham's role had been exactly as suspected. He had used his position at the postal office to identify valuable shipments and redirect them to accomplices who sold them through black market channels. But the documents also revealed the names of other participants in the conspiracy, including several people who were still respected members of the village community. Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock said as they reviewed the documents in Mrs. Thornfield's study, these records suggest that the black market activities were far more extensive than we initially realized. There were at least 6 people in the village who were directly involved, and probably others who knew about the activities but chose not to report them. And some of those people are still living in Rosehill Green. At least 3 of them, based on the names I recognize, which means that Harold Wickham's return represented a threat to multiple people, not just Mrs. Thornfield. Miss Marple studied the documents carefully, paying particular attention to the handwriting and organizational methods that had been used to maintain these records. The person who had killed Harold Wickham and possibly Mrs. Thornfield would almost certainly be someone mentioned in these papers, but identifying the specific individual would require careful analysis of who had both motive and opportunity for both crimes. More importantly, the killer had demonstrated a willingness to commit multiple murders to protect their secrets. If they suspected that the investigation was closing in on them, they might be prepared to take even more desperate action to avoid exposure. The documents from Mrs. Thornfield's safe had revealed a conspiracy far more complex and extensive than anyone had initially suspected. As Miss Marple studied the carefully preserved records in Colonel Hartwell's sitting room that evening, she began to understand the full scope of the criminal network that had operated in Rosehill Green during the war years. Harold Wickham had indeed been at the center of the conspiracy, but he had not been working alone. The documents revealed a sophisticated operation involving postal theft, black market sales, and financial arrangements that had enriched several village residents while causing severe hardship for others. Colonel, I noticed that one name appears repeatedly in these records, often in connection with financial transactions and coordination activities. Colonel Hartwell leaned over to examine the documents Miss Marple was indicating. Mrs. Pemberton? That's impossible, Miss Marple. Alice Pemberton is one of the most respectable women in the village. She's been involved in every charitable activity and community organization for decades, which would have made her an excellent cover for coordinating black market activities, Colonel. Someone in Mrs. Pemberton's position would have access to information about village residents' needs and expectations, and she would be trusted with handling financial arrangements that might otherwise seem suspicious. Miss Marple pointed to specific entries in the ledgers. According to these records, Mrs. Pemberton was responsible for identifying potential customers for stolen goods, arranging sales transactions, and distributing the profits among the conspiracy members. She appears to have been the operational coordinator for the entire scheme. Colonel Hartwell looked genuinely shocked. But Miss Marple, Mrs. Pemberton, was the one who discovered Harold Wickham's body. She was the one who provided information about his wartime activities to Inspector Craddock. Why would she draw attention to herself if she had been involved in the original crimes? Because, Colonel, she realized that Harold Wickham's return posed a threat that needed to be managed carefully. By positioning herself as a helpful witness and source of historical information, she could influence the direction of the investigation while ensuring that certain details remained hidden. Miss Marple had been troubled from the beginning by Mrs. Pemberton's role in the investigation. The elderly woman had seemed remarkably well informed about Harold Wickham's activities and their impact on village residents, and she had been very quick to provide Inspector Craddock with information that pointed suspicion toward other people. But what about her apparent shock when she discovered the body? Surely that reaction was genuine. I'm sure it was, Colonel. Mrs. Pemberton is not a natural killer. She would have found the act of murder deeply disturbing, even if she believed it was necessary. But her shock at discovering the body doesn't mean she wasn't responsible for placing it there. Miss Marple had been gradually reconstructing the events of the night before the flower show. Mrs. Pemberton would have had easy access to the village green, and as one of the show's judges, she would have been familiar with the layout of all the exhibits, including Mrs. Thornfield's prize roses. The placement of Harold Wickham's body among Mrs. Thornfield's roses was not arbitrary, Colonel. It was a deliberate choice designed to implicate Mrs. Thornfield while also sending a symbolic message about the connection between past crimes and present consequences. And Mrs. Thornfield's death. I believe Mrs. Pemberton realized that Mrs. Thornfield was preparing to reveal the documents we discovered today. She couldn't allow that information to become public because it would have exposed not only Mrs. Thornfield's involvement, but her own as well. The method of Mrs. Thornfield's murder had been particularly clever, Miss Marple reflected. By inducing a heart attack in someone with a known cardiac condition, Mrs. Pemberton had created a death that would appear natural while eliminating a dangerous witness. But how could Mrs. Pemberton have induced a heart attack? She has no medical training. She wouldn't have needed medical training, Colonel, just access to certain substances that could trigger cardiac arrest in someone with Mrs. Thornfield's condition. The documents mentioned that medical supplies were among the items stolen and sold through black market channels. Mrs. Pemberton would have had knowledge about various medications and their effects. Miss Marple had noticed during her tea with Mrs. Pemberton that the elderly woman had demonstrated considerable knowledge about garden pests and plant diseases. Such knowledge would naturally extend to an understanding of toxic substances and their physiological effects. Miss Marple, if your analysis is correct, then Mrs. Pemberton represents a continuing danger to anyone else who might possess information about the wartime conspiracy. Exactly, Colonel, which is why I believe we need to take immediate action to prevent any additional murders. Miss Marple had been considering how to proceed with her suspicions about Mrs. Pemberton. The evidence from the documents was compelling, but it would not be sufficient for a criminal conviction without additional proof of her involvement in the recent murders. I think it's time to set a trap, Colonel. Mrs. Pemberton believes she has successfully eliminated the primary threats to her secret, but she doesn't know that we've discovered the documents that expose her role in the wartime conspiracy. What sort of trap did you have in mind? We need to convince Mrs. Pemberton that there's another person who possesses dangerous information about her activities, someone who needs to be eliminated before they can share that information with Inspector Craddock. Miss Marple's plan would require careful coordination with Inspector Craddock and considerable personal risk for whoever served as the bait in the trap. But it seemed to be the only way to obtain the proof necessary to expose Mrs. Pemberton's crimes and prevent her from claiming additional victims. Colonel, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to help me with something that may seem rather unethical, but which I believe is necessary to prevent further murders. Colonel Hartwell straightened in his chair with a military bearing that always emerged when he was faced with important decisions. Miss Marple, if you're convinced that Mrs. Pemberton is responsible for these murders, then I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to stop her. The trap Miss Marple had in mind would require Mrs. Pemberton to reveal herself through her own actions, but it would also put someone in considerable danger. She only hoped that they could execute the plan successfully without giving Mrs. Pemberton the opportunity to claim another victim. Miss Marple's plan required the cooperation of Inspector Craddock and the unwitting participation of Mrs. Fletcher, who would serve as the bait to draw Mrs. Pemberton into revealing her murderous intentions. The plan was risky, but it seemed to be the only way to obtain concrete evidence of Mrs. Pemberton's guilt. The first step was to plant information that would reach Mrs. Pemberton and convince her that Mrs. Fletcher possessed evidence that could expose her role in the wartime conspiracy. This was accomplished through a carefully staged conversation between Miss Marple and Colonel Hartwell at the Rose and Crown, conducted just loudly enough for other patrons to overhear. "Colonel, I'm very concerned about what Mrs. Fletcher told me this afternoon," Miss Marple said, ensuring that her voice carried to the nearby tables where several village residents were enjoying their evening drinks. "About the documents her mother-in-law left behind?" "Exactly. She said she'd been going through old papers in the attic and found some very interesting correspondence from the war years. Letters that mentioned specific names and activities that could be quite embarrassing for certain people if they became public." Colonel Hartwell played his part convincingly. "Did she say whether she planned to share this information with Inspector Craddock?" "She's planning to meet with him tomorrow morning to turn over the documents. She feels it's her civic duty, especially in light of what happened to Harold Wickham and Mrs. Thornfield." Miss Marple was confident that this conversation would be reported to Mrs. Pemberton within hours, as such dramatic information always traveled quickly through village social networks. The next step was to position Inspector Craddock and several constables in concealed locations around Mrs. Fletcher's cottage, where they could intervene if Mrs. Pemberton attempted to harm her. Mrs. Fletcher, when she was finally informed about the plan, proved to be remarkably brave about the risks involved. "Miss Marple, if Mrs. Pemberton really is responsible for these murders, then she needs to be stopped before she kills anyone else. I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to help catch her. Mrs. Fletcher, I must emphasize that we believe Mrs. Pemberton to be extremely dangerous. She has already killed at least 2 people, and she won't hesitate to kill again if she believes her secret is threatened. Understand, Miss Marple, but my mother-in-law died because of what Mrs. Pemberton and her accomplices did during the war years. If I can help ensure that she faces justice for her crimes, then I'm prepared to take the risk." The trap was set for the following evening. Mrs. Fletcher would remain in her cottage after dark, ostensibly alone, while Inspector Craddock and his men maintained their surveillance from concealed positions. Miss Marple would also be watching from Colonel Hartwell's cottage, which provided a clear view of Mrs. Fletcher's property. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of the plan. Mrs. Pemberton was an intelligent woman who would approach any attempt at murder with careful planning and attention to detail. She would not act impulsively or carelessly, which meant that the trap might not be sprung immediately. As evening fell on Rosehill Green, Miss Marple found herself positioned at Colonel Hartwell's front window with a pair of binoculars, watching for any signs of movement around Mrs. Fletcher's cottage. The village seemed unusually quiet, as if the residents sensed that something significant was about to happen. At approximately 10 o'clock, Miss Marple observed a figure moving carefully through the shadows near Mrs. Fletcher's garden. The person was taking considerable care to avoid being seen, using the cover of hedges and outbuildings to approach the cottage without being detected from the road. "Colonel, I believe our trap is about to be sprung. Could you telephone Inspector Craddock and let him know that someone is approaching Mrs. Fletcher's cottage?" Through her binoculars, Miss Marple could see that the figure was indeed Mrs. Pemberton, moving with surprising agility for a woman of her age. She was carrying what appeared to be a small bag, presumably containing whatever means she intended to use to eliminate Mrs. Fletcher. Mrs. Pemberton approached the cottage's back door and spent several minutes working at the lock with what Miss Marple assumed were lock-picking tools. The elderly woman was clearly more skilled in criminal techniques than her respectable appearance would suggest. Once Mrs. Pemberton had gained entry to the cottage, Miss Marple lost sight of her, but she knew that Inspector Craddock's men would be moving into position to prevent any harm from coming to Mrs. Fletcher. The next few minutes would be crucial in determining whether their plan would succeed in exposing Mrs. Pemberton's guilt. The sound of breaking glass from the direction of Mrs. Fletcher's cottage indicated that something had gone wrong with the plan. Miss Marple saw several figures running toward the cottage, and she heard Inspector Craddock shouting orders to his constables. "Colonel, I think we need to go and see what's happened. I pray that Mrs. Fletcher is safe." As they hurried toward Mrs. Fletcher's cottage, Miss Marple could see that the situation had become more complicated than they had anticipated. There were lights on throughout the cottage, and she could hear voices indicating that some sort of confrontation had taken place. Inspector Craddock met them at the cottage door, looking relieved but somewhat shaken. "Miss Marple, I'm happy to report that Mrs. Fletcher is safe and that we have Mrs. Pemberton in custody. However, the situation became rather more dramatic than we had planned." "What happened, Inspector?" Mrs. Pemberton apparently realized that it was a trap almost as soon as she entered the cottage. Instead of attempting to harm Mrs. Fletcher, she tried to escape through a window, which is when the glass was broken. "My constables were able to apprehend her, but not before she had attempted to destroy some sort of evidence she was carrying." Miss Marple felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. While they had successfully prevented Mrs. Pemberton from harming Mrs. Fletcher, they had not obtained the clear evidence of murderous intent that would have been necessary to prove her guilt in the previous crimes. However, as Inspector Craddock explained the details of Mrs. Pemberton's arrest, it became clear that she had been caught with materials that were highly incriminating, even if they had not been used to commit an actual crime. Mrs. Pemberton sat in Inspector Craddock's makeshift interview room at the village hall, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of the evidence that had been assembled against her. The bag she had been carrying when arrested contained not only tools for breaking and entering, but also a small vial of digitalis, a heart medication that could prove fatal in large doses. Miss Marple had been invited to observe the interview, understanding that her insights into Mrs. Pemberton's psychology might prove valuable in obtaining a confession. The elderly woman who had seemed so helpful and respectable just days earlier now appeared haggard and desperate, finally confronted with the consequences of crimes she had committed decades ago. "Mrs. Pemberton," Inspector Craddock began carefully, "we've discovered the document from Mrs. Thornfield's safe, and we know about your role in the wartime black market conspiracy. We also know that you killed Harold Wickham and Mrs. Thornfield to prevent them from exposing that conspiracy. What I'd like to understand is why you decided to take such extreme measures after so many years." Mrs. Pemberton remained silent for several moments, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You have to understand, Inspector, that the war years were a time when normal moral standards simply didn't apply. People were dying, families were starving, and the official systems for distributing essential supplies had completely broken down. So you decided to take matters into your own hands? Harold Wickham approached me in 1945 with a proposal that seemed reasonable at the time. He said he could identify valuable shipments that were being sent to people who didn't really need them and redirect those shipments to people who were desperate. In exchange, we would take a small percentage of the profits to compensate us for the risks we were taking." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "But Mrs. Pemberton, those shipments weren't going to people who didn't need them. They were going to people like Mrs. Ashworth's husband, who required specific medications to survive." Mrs. Pemberton's composure broke entirely at this point, and tears began streaming down her face. "I know that now, Miss Marple, but at the time, Harold convinced me that we were performing a valuable service by ensuring that supplies reached people who could afford to pay for them, rather than being wasted on people who might not use them properly. And when people began dying because they couldn't get the supplies they needed, I tried to stop the operation then, but Harold said it was too late to back out. He said we were all implicated, and that if anyone was caught, we would all go to prison. So we continued, and more people suffered, and I've lived with the guilt of those decisions every day for the past 15 years. Inspector Craddock consulted his notes. Mrs. Pemberton, according to the documents we found, you were more than just a reluctant participant in this conspiracy. You were actively involved in coordinating sales and distributing profits. You can't claim that you were simply following Harold Wickham's instructions. Mrs. Pemberton nodded slowly. You're right, Inspector. I became very involved in the operation, and I did profit significantly from it. The money I made during those years allowed me to maintain my position in the village and to contribute to various charitable activities. In a way, I convinced myself that I was using ill-gotten gains for good purposes. But when Harold returned to the village, that comfortable rationalization was threatened. Harold's return changed everything, Miss Marple. He wasn't interested in keeping the past buried. He wanted to use his knowledge of our wartime activities to extract money from all of us. He approached me with a blackmail scheme that would have destroyed not only my reputation, but the lives of several other people in the village. Miss Marple understood the psychological pressure that Mrs. Pemberton must have felt. She had spent 15 years building a respectable life on foundations that would not bear scrutiny, and Harold Wickham's return had threatened to destroy everything she had worked to achieve. So you decided to kill him. I didn't plan to kill him initially, Miss Marple. I arranged to meet with him the night before the flower show to discuss his demands and see if we could reach some sort of compromise. But when I realized that his demands would never end, and that he was prepared to destroy multiple families to satisfy his greed, I felt that I had no choice. And you used Dr. Hammond's scalpel as the murder weapon? I had taken the scalpel from Dr. Hammond's surgery several weeks earlier, thinking that I might need it for protection if Harold became threatening. When I decided to kill him, it seemed like the obvious choice, and I thought that suspicion would fall on Dr. Hammond rather than on me. Inspector Craddock looked up from his notes. Why did you place Harold's body among Mrs. Thornfield's roses? Because I knew that Victoria had been Harold's primary accomplice during the war years, and I wanted to ensure that she would also be implicated in his death. I thought that if the police discovered the connections between them, Victoria would be arrested and the focus of the investigation would shift away from the other people who had been involved in the conspiracy. Miss Marple found this explanation particularly chilling. Mrs. Pemberton had not only committed murder, but had deliberately attempted to frame another person for the crime, showing a level of calculated malice that belied her respectable appearance. And when Mrs. Thornfield began considering revealing the documents that would expose the wartime conspiracy, I realized that Victoria's conscience was beginning to trouble her, and that she might decide to confess everything to clear her own name. I couldn't allow that to happen, because it would have implicated not only me, but several other people in the village who had been involved in the conspiracy. So you induced a heart attack using digitalis. Mrs. Pemberton nodded miserably. I knew about Victoria's heart condition, and I knew that digitalis could trigger a fatal cardiac episode if administered in sufficient quantities. I arranged to meet with her in her garden, ostensibly to discuss the investigation, and I slipped the digitalis in a tea that I brought with me. The methodical planning that had gone into both murders demonstrated that Mrs. Pemberton was far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. She had been prepared to kill multiple people to protect her secret, and she would probably have continued killing if Miss Marple had not exposed her. Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Marple said gently, I understand that you were trying to protect not only yourself, but other people who had been involved in the wartime activities. But surely you must realize that murder was not the solution to your problems. I know that now, Miss Marple. But at the time, it seemed like the only way to prevent Harold from destroying the lives of innocent people who had made mistakes during a very difficult period. I thought that if I could eliminate Harold and Victoria, the secrets of the war years could remain buried and everyone else could continue living their lives in peace. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook and looked at Mrs. Pemberton with a mixture of pity and disgust. Mrs. Pemberton, I'm arresting you for the murders of Harold Wickham and Victoria Thornfield, and for the attempted murder of Mrs. Fletcher. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used as evidence against you. As Mrs. Pemberton was led away in handcuffs, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic sequence of events that had culminated in this moment. The war years had created circumstances that had corrupted otherwise decent people, leading them to make decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Harold Wickham's attempt to profit from those old crimes had triggered a chain of violence that had claimed 3 lives and shattered the peace of Rosehill Green forever. In the days following Mrs. Pemberton's arrest, the full scope of the wartime conspiracy that had operated in Rosehill Green gradually became clear. Inspector Craddock's investigation, aided by the documents from Mrs. Thornfield's safe and Mrs. Pemberton's confession, revealed a complex network of theft, fraud, and black market sales that had enriched some village residents while causing others to suffer and die. Miss Marple found herself serving as an unofficial counselor to village residents who were struggling to understand how someone they had known and trusted for decades could have been capable of such calculated violence. The revelation of Mrs. Pemberton's crimes had shattered many assumptions about the nature of respectability and moral authority in small communities. Dr. Hammond, who had been the primary suspect for much of the investigation, expressed a mixture of relief and sadness when he met with Miss Marple to discuss the case's resolution. "Miss Marple, I'm grateful that you were able to see through Inspector Craddock's case against me, but I'm deeply troubled by what we've learned about Mrs. Pemberton. She was someone I had respected and trusted for many years. Dr. Hammond, I think you should understand that Mrs. Pemberton's crimes don't invalidate all the good work she did in the village over the past 15 years. People are complex, and it's possible for someone to commit terrible acts while also performing genuine acts of charity and community service. But how do we reconcile those contradictions? How do we understand someone who could organize charitable activities to help the poor while simultaneously stealing supplies from people who desperately needed them?" Miss Marple had been pondering this question herself. "I think Mrs. Pemberton's charitable activities were partly an attempt to atone for her wartime crimes, Dr. Hammond. She was trying to balance the scales by doing good deeds that would offset the harm she had caused. Unfortunately, that kind of moral accounting doesn't actually work. You can't undo past wrongs by performing present good deeds." Mrs. Ashworth had struggled particularly with the revelations about Mrs. Pemberton's role in her husband's death. The woman she had known as a helpful neighbor and community leader had been directly responsible for the theft of medications that could have saved her husband's life. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to feel about Mrs. Pemberton. Part of me hates her for what she did to my husband, but another part of me feels sorry for her. She seemed genuinely remorseful when she confessed, and I know she helped many people in the village over the years. Mrs. Ashworth, I think you're responding with the kind of compassion that makes communities like Rosehill Green worth preserving. It would be understandable if you felt nothing but anger toward Mrs. Pemberton, but your ability to see her as a complex human being rather than simply a monster speaks well of your character." The investigation had also revealed that there were other village residents who had been involved in the wartime conspiracy, though their roles had been less central than Mrs. Pemberton's. Inspector Craddock faced difficult decisions about whether to prosecute people for crimes committed decades earlier under extraordinary circumstances. "Miss Marple, I'm struggling with how to handle the other people who were implicated in the wartime activities. Most of them seem to have been relatively minor participants who were drawn into the conspiracy by Mrs. Pemberton and Harold Wickham. Do you think it serves any purpose to prosecute them now?" "Inspector, I think you have to balance the demands of justice against the practical realities of the situation. The primary organizers of the conspiracy, Harold Wickham and Mrs. Pemberton, are both beyond a reach of justice now, one through death and the other through imprisonment. The remaining participants were mostly people who made poor decisions under difficult circumstances, and they've spent the past 15 years living with the consequences of those decisions." Inspector Craddock nodded thoughtfully. "I'm inclined to focus on ensuring that the truth about what happened is documented and understood, rather than pursuing prosecutions that might cause more harm than good. The community has suffered enough disruption." Miss Marple agreed with this approach. In her experience, the most important function of criminal investigation was often not punishment, but understanding, helping communities comprehend how and why crimes had occurred so that they could take steps to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Colonel Hartwell had been particularly affected by the revelations about Mrs. Pemberton, having worked closely with her on various village committees and charitable activities for many years. "Miss Marple, I keep wondering whether there were signs that I should have noticed, indications that Mrs. Pemberton was capable of such calculated violence. But looking back, I can't identify anything that would have suggested she was dangerous. Colonel, I don't think there were signs that you could reasonably have been expected to notice. Mrs. Pemberton had spent 15 years carefully constructing a respectable persona that concealed her past crimes. She was very skilled at presenting herself as someone who could be trusted and relied upon. But doesn't that suggest that we can never really know anyone? That any of our neighbors might be hiding terrible secrets? Miss Marple considered this carefully. I think it suggests that we should be humble about how well we can know other people, Colonel. But I don't think it means we should become suspicious of everyone around us. Most people are exactly what they appear to be, decent individuals doing their best to live good lives. Mrs. Pemberton was an exception, not the rule. As Miss Marple prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the lessons that could be drawn from the tragic events in Rosehill Green. The war years had created circumstances that had corrupted some people and tested everyone's moral principles. The consequences of decisions made during that difficult period had continued to reverberate 15 years later, ultimately leading to multiple murders and the destruction of lives and relationships that had taken years to build. But the investigation had also revealed the fundamental resilience and decency of most village residents. People like Dr. Hammond, Mrs. Ashworth, Mrs. Fletcher, and Colonel Hartwell had faced terrible revelations about someone they had trusted, yet they had responded with compassion and wisdom rather than anger and vengeance. It was that resilience, Miss Marple believed, that would allow Rosehill Green to recover from this tragedy and continue to be the kind of community where people could live peacefully and support one another through life's inevitable challenges. 6 months after the arrest of Mrs. Pemberton for the murders of Harold Wickham and Victoria Thornfield, Rosehill Green had begun to find its way back to something resembling normal village life. The shock of discovering that one of their most respected residents had been a killer had gradually given way to a more complex understanding of human nature and the lasting consequences of moral choices made under extreme circumstances. Miss Marple returned to the village for the annual spring flower show, which had been reinstated after much discussion about whether it would be appropriate to continue the tradition so closely associated with the previous year's tragic events. The decision to proceed had been made collectively, with the understanding that the show represented the community's determination to move forward while honoring the memory of those who had died. Mrs. Thornfield's rose garden had been maintained by several village volunteers, and her prize varieties were once again among the most spectacular displays at the show. A small memorial plaque had been placed among the roses, acknowledging her contributions to the village while tactfully avoiding reference to the circumstances of her death. "Miss Marple, how good to see you again," Dr. Hammond greeted her as she examined the rose displays. "I'm pleased that you could return for the show. It seems fitting that you should be here to see how the village has recovered."